So, welcome to the second talk of Beyond Words, the seminar series dedicated to the values that guide us at IIT. Today, we continue our journey of a reflection on what defines us as an institution and as a community. IIT values are the driving force behind everything we do. They shape our decision and guide our scientific research. That's why with these talks, we explore how human behavior shapes our choices and how those choices can bring IIT values to life in powerful and tangible ways. These values inspire us to think deeply, act with purpose, and grow together. So I encourage you to participate in this session with open-mindedness and to share your experiences and questions. In our last seminar, we explored the value of courage, learning that by facing challenges with determination, we can strive for excellence. In the next seminars, we will focus on integrity, exploring what acting with honesty means, and inclusion, discovering how to embrace diversity and respect the uniqueness of every individual. In today's session, we will explore societal responsibility. These values reflect our commitment to contributing to the development of society for the common good and inspire us to look beyond personal or organizational success and to focus on action that benefit humanity as a whole. So thank you for being here. I leave the floor to Nasya, who's going to say a few words before we leave the floor to the speaker.
So, good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure for me to welcome you to today's seminar. Today we have with us Professor Elisabeth Gsottbauer. Okay. I found it how to pronounce it on the internet because I was not sure. Elisabeth is a leading voice in environmental economics and sustainability. She's currently a professor at the Free University of Bolzano, and she's also there the head of the Competence Centre for Sustainability. And this is how I met her. I'm very happy for this. And actually, Elisabeth brings with her a wealth of international experience. She has been to the London School of Economics, to the University of Cambridge, the University of Innsbruck, and now the University of Bolzano. She has published her research in top journals such as Nature Sustainability, Nature Communications, Economic Journal, and so on. And her work is focusing on how individual behavior can drive systemic changes. And she explored this area through field and survey experiments. So this is at the interface of the economic, sustainability, and policy also, policymaking. Now, she will take us to this very nice journey of how our behaviors could affect so behavior, individual responsibility, and society choices could shape the future of our planet. And I want to say also that what we are going to hear today fits very, very well also to our flagship. We have a flagship that is central to IIT now about technologies for sustainability. So it's very, very nice to hear another point of view of how we can be sustainable, not only through our technologies, but also through our behavior. So for this reason, I'm very, very happy to have Professor Gsottbauer here. And please join me for a warm welcome to her. Thank you, Elisabeth.
Right. Thanks very much for a very kind introduction, and also thanks for providing me the opportunity to be here and for getting me here. Also, this team who I see here. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the question what motivates us to protect the climate, and I will link it a lot to policy. So it's about behavior and what does this mean for policy, because at the end of the day, we probably need a couple of more policies in order to make this world probably a little bit more at least sustainable. Now, the roadmap of this presentation, I will first talk a little bit why an economist. So I'm an economist, why I even care about this topic. So what's the economic challenge, so to say? I will then dive into the thing of human behavior and the question what drives us to protect the climate. And as I said, how does if we know how human behavior works, what does this mean for effective environmental or climate policy? I show you an approach I'm using. I think that ensuring effective interventions or policies for behavioral change need some type of experimental framework. And I'll end with a kind of suggestion of types of policies, which I believe we will probably end up with a policy mix which is needed to motivate more sustainable behavior or more climate-friendly behavior. Well, okay, this graph, you might be familiar with this, but yeah, well, I'll quickly talk you through also because I can only recommend you the homepage Our World in Data. I think it's a great initiative by a couple of academics at Oxford, also one former student of Innsbruck, in fact. And you can see very clearly greenhouse gases are increasing in the lately, I would say, particularly since 1950. What you also see on this graph quite nicely, you see sometimes we have managed to decrease our carbon emissions, right? You see one drop a couple of years ago, that was the COVID pandemic. So there we decreased our carbon emissions. Then further down, there's another drop in this line, that's the financial crisis. And further down is the other couple of drops, oil crisis in the 80s. So basically, it tells you that the only time we or the global community have managed to decrease carbon emissions is when we were in crisis. So now is the question, okay, so do we have to get into crisis in order to reduce our carbon emissions, or do we have other ways? Because why is this a problem? When carbon emissions and human activities linked to it have basically led, or at least that's the IPCC report are quite clear on that, that they are linked to global warming. So we have carbon emissions caused by human activities, so human behavior, and this leads to climate change, global warming. Why is this a problem, or why is this a problem from an economic point of view? Well, that's my timer. I'm not finished yet. So, why is this an economic problem? Well, we have tons of natural disasters that lead to economic costs. We have human capital affected, greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, diseases, sickness, people die earlier, etc. So there are many, many severe consequences from higher temperatures, from global warming, from climate change. We really also, from an economic point, we would like to avoid. Now to step back a little bit. Okay, so now we know carbon emissions are increasing. We would like to decrease them because we think they are linked to global warming and we don't like that. So what determines carbon emissions? Because in order to see, okay, we want to tackle carbon emissions, let's get into the question, what are the factors driving carbon emissions? And here I go back to a Japanese economist, Kaya, who came up with the Kaya identity and who tells us that CO2 emissions are calculated by multiplying 4 factors: population size, GDP per person, energy consumption, and CO2 emissions per energy consumed. So it's pretty easy, in fact. The more people we are, and the higher our economic output is, the higher will be our emissions. And CO2 emissions, besides population and GDP per capita, are also determined by something what we call energy intensity or energy consumption per GDP we produce. So how much energy do we need to produce a dollar of economic output, and how CO2 intensive our energy is. So the one is the more energy we use, the more carbon emissions we have. But it depends a little bit on the type of energy. That's the CO2 emissions per energy. That's the CO2 intensity. If we only use energy which is renewable, like solar, wind, etc., then we should be fine, in fact. So we have these 4 factors. Let me just see. So we could change population. Well, difficult, I guess. There are very few countries who have population policies, right? Well, China had one, as some other communist countries. But it's clearly contentious issues, and no politician is going to basically say, well, we have to decrease population size in order to decrease carbon emissions. Then we have the second factor, GDP. As you know, most economists, most politicians are also not a big fan to decrease or to degrow our economies in order to reduce our emissions. So basically, we are left with tackling 2 things. We can tackle how much energy we use and how CO2 intensive our energy is. So these are basically our leverage points at the end of the day. If we agree to some extent that we don't want to touch population as much as economic output. Now let's look at how all those 4 factors have been developing in the last years. So we see CO2 emissions. You have seen this. Horizontal axis time, vertical axis increase since 65. So CO2 emissions have been increasing. There are a couple of down points. You see 2 very prominently: Corona crisis as much as the financial crisis around 2010 or around 2010. GDP per capita, well, you see those still 2 things are perfectly correlated. GDP has been increasing. When GDP was going down, carbon emissions were going down. Population, linear growth rate. So 2 of the factors which determine carbon emissions, highly correlated with carbon emissions, and all of them have been increasing. So we see carbon intensity and energy intensity. So energy intensity, how efficient we are, so how efficient we use our energy, has been going down. I think that's good, meaning we have become more efficient. We have more efficient washing machines and appliances, and are more careful with the amount of energy we use. And carbon intensity is a little bit more flat, also going down. So meaning how much carbon is in the energy we use. So it's good. It's also decreasing, meaning we use more wind, solar. So we use more energy which has less carbon. But it's rather flat. So that also tells you like the energy transition is probably slower, like energy transition in a sense that we change from oil or gas to solar or wind, like to energy which is less carbon, is going slower as expected. Now let's answer one more question before I go into the energy and carbon intensity. So I've basically exclude population from the equation because it will be very difficult to tackle that. But what about answering the question, maybe we don't have to reduce our GDP because it could be possible to reduce emissions while the economy grows. So can we basically grow our economies and reduce our carbon emissions? Well, we have seen that in many, many countries. So here, particularly in Europe, you look at the UK, France, Germany, Sweden, as even the States and Finland. You see in the blue line GDP per capita, and you see the red line CO2 emissions per capita. And what you see is basically they are diverging. So apparently many countries have exactly achieved that. So we don't have to worry about growing our economies because we can grow them, and at the same time we decrease our emissions. This is also referred in the literature as decoupling. And this is something, if you read a report by the European Union or by the World Bank, this is basically what they want. So we want to grow our economies while at the same time our carbon emissions decrease, like the decoupling, and it's possible at the national level. But now I show you like a little bit of bad news here. It's clearly not possible at the moment at the global level. So you have again this graph you have now seen a couple of times. CO2 emission is growing, GDP is increasing, population is increasing. And that's a problem. Why is this a problem? Because carbon emissions are unfortunately a global problem. It doesn't matter if Italy or the UK are decoupling, because it doesn't matter where we emit our carbon, be it in the UK or in India or in Italy. If we don't manage the decoupling at the global level, the individual decoupling is worth very little, because yeah, carbon emissions are a global problem. It doesn't matter where we emit. So we basically would need the decoupling at the global level. And to me, I don't see it, but it just tells you it's very, very difficult. Okay, so we leave the discussion on population and economic output because not easy. So let's focus on the leverage points. Can we make our societies more energy intensive, also less energy intensive? So we are more efficient. We use less energy. If we use less energy, we have less carbon. Can we make them less carbon intensive? Meaning not only using less energy, but using energy which has hardly carbon, which would be wind, solar, renewable, nuclear, etc. Okay, so the key leverage points would be efficiency improvements. What's the problem with that? Getting more energy efficient? Well, There are some, as we know this from studies, there are probably some limitations how efficient we can get, because we will always need energy to live, right? To live, to produce, to consume. So we should be careful how efficient we can get. So there might be limited efficiency gains, and there are also potential rebound effects. You might have heard of these famous studies that someone gets a hybrid car, but then just drives more kilometers. So even though he or she has now a more efficient car, he drives now more. So he basically offsets his efficiency with driving around more. That would be like rebound effects. Then technological substitution. So we really hope that everyone changes to an electric car and we won't have problems with gas and fuel, etc. anymore. But we also know, and electric cars are a good example, that the transition is rather slow. I mean, most likely, I'm still quite optimistic that it will come, but because the European Union also has this directive by 2035, new cars should be all electric. So why should we be worried? Well, we should be worried because it's not clear if we keep that directive until 2035. It's highly lobbied. It already had been watered down. So technological substitution is happening, but it's going slower than expected. Okay, so this brings us, okay, if we can't solve it with better innovations and better technology, because efficiency improvements also not easy, and if we can't solve it with substituting to cleaner technology or faster to cleaner technology, what can we do on the demand side, on the consumer side? So, and this will be a little bit the rest of the talk. Okay, how can we basically motivate individuals on that side? And demand side solutions are an interesting chapter. There are a couple of studies, you see two of them. Demand side solutions to climate change mitigation consistent with high levels of well-being. So that's good, even if people reduce the demand for energy as much as if they switch to less carbon intensive energy products, they're still fine. That's good. I think we care about their welfare. We don't want to make them worse off, right? And another comment about the demand side solution for mitigating climate change. And Kreutzig has done an interesting study, and it's also cited in the IPCC assessment report, because what potential do consumer adjustments offer for mitigating climate change? And he says, well, the potential is pretty good. Adjustments at the consumption level could technically allow reductions of, for example, 80% in the housing sector. Think about that you're renovating your house, that you're changing from gas to some other type of heating, like to a heat pump or something similar. Around 60% in transport. This is basically you switching to public transport, or as said, going more into technological substitution to an electric car. And like even 40% in food, meaning that's you changing from a meat-heavy diet to a less meat-heavy diet or a vegetarian diet or something similar, or that you source what you eat from local sources instead of transport. So I think that's quite large shares, what we could reach like bottom up from the consumer side. Now, in order to tackle demand side solutions, I think we need to answer two questions, or we need to go through 2 points. So we should understand behavior, like how people make decisions when they buy stuff, when they invest, etc. And we should not only know how human behavior works, but we should then look into what works to achieve behavior change. And I try to answer these 2 points now. So what motivates us to protect the climate, and what does this mean for policy? Now, if you ask an economist, they would say, well, that's pretty easy, what motivates people, because he or she would come, well, you know, there's the textbook Homo economicus, he does cost-benefit analysis, he only goes for something if he has a benefit of it, otherwise he would never buy it or invest. It's quite rational. All the information he or she receives can optimally process it, etc. Okay, probably this person exists. If this person exists, then the policy recommendations are very easy, because then it will mean, well, if you're all Homo economicus in this room, then we just need to adjust prices, because people will perfectly react to prices. We could do this through carbon taxes. We could do this through subsidies. We could implement regulations, because we would assume that people adhere to regulation. think about tempo limits on the highway and how many people adhere to them, for instance. We could include other type of regulatory framework standards or the CSRD, sustainability reporting, because we would say, well, companies will optimally react to those type of regulations, etc. So this is the policy we should implement if we believe that these homo economicus exist. Well, there's another sub-branch of economists. So even economists have realized that that's probably not true. And homo economicus doesn't exist in its perfectly, let's say. And there are many other motivators people have. They have values, they care about their social identity, they care about what their peers do, they care about what the family does, they care about what the neighbor does. They might have moral obligations to act, like intergenerational concerns. There might be social pressure, they have emotions, etc. So there are many, many more things than prices, which probably motivates behavior. That then also opens a new, so to say, policy book or policy recommendations, because if you assume that, then we should probably invest more in education, awareness campaign. We'll look into nudging later, public recognition. We should probably also adjust our taxes, because we can't assume that people react perfectly to price increases, messaging, etc. So basically, there are two policy books we now have in our hand. On the one hand, we can go with standard policies. On the other hand, if we consider how human behavior is probably more complex, we probably need or can use additional tools, so to say. Okay, I'll show you two insights from behavioral economics and how we can use them for policy. So we know, behavioral economics, also to give you a little bit of background, was born by two economists, which actually are psychologists, Daniel Kahneman, and Amon Tversky, who both also won the Nobel Prize in economics for their work that human behavior is way richer than we think it is, and what it means for economic modeling and economic theory. Now, one way they also looked, as much as other people looked at, is that our behavior is influenced by other people, by our family, by our friends, by our peer, by social learning, by our identity. We care about the group to whom we belong. There are a lot of definitions here, some definitions of social norms by economists, psychologists. Newberg, for instance, says a social norm is a predominant behavioral pattern within a group supported by a shared understanding of acceptable actions and sustained through social interactions with that group. Cialdini, a famous psychologist, can refer either to what is commonly done, that is what is normal, or to what is commonly approved, that is what is socially sanctioned. So I think we all have some understanding of social norm, and here just a couple of definitions. Okay, but the key thing is, okay, now we know that people care not only about their income, but they also care what others do, what their peers do, etc. So how can we use this for policy? Well, I'll show you one example, and it's a pretty famous one. So we can use information about your neighbors, about your family, to motivate people, so to say. So there's O-Power, that's energy consultants, energy utility in the US. And what they do is they provide customer feedback on energy usage, and they compare your own household, to all of your neighbors. On the right-hand side, you see one of their letters, or kind of template letters. So they tell you, well, you are the blue bar, you have used that much energy. Your most efficient neighbor, in fact, in the same street, has used less energy than you, as you see in the green bar, and all your neighbors, in fact, use more energy. And then they give you a bit of a rating. They say, well, you're pretty okay. You could do better. You're still using quite a lot of energy. So that's a very light touch intervention, right? So you tell people what they use, that's usually on your energy bill, but then you also pinpointed on what your neighbor does, who is more efficient, you're rated, your behavior is good or bad, etc. And well, the interesting thing is this works, right? So we have an evaluation, or now many evaluations in energy, as much as in other domains. Here's one by Alcott already like 20 years ago. He looked at this together with O-Power. O-Power was the first energy utility who did that. They just sent out letters. Well, they referred to the Social Comparison Energy Report. They did it with 600,000 households. 300,000 received the letters, 300,000 did not receive the letters. And they found that those receiving those letters reduced energy consumption by 2%. Yeah, you could say 2%, what's that? But given that price interventions in the energy sector are very difficult, we only see higher energy prices again if we are in crisis, remember. If we look back at the start of the Russian-Ukrainian war, then we had high energy prices. Now they've gone down again. So 2% demand reduction at the household sector is equivalent to like a 10 to 20% price rise. And that's quite substantial. We only see like 20% price hikes if we are in crisis because, there was no gas coming from Russia, for instance. So for being such a light touch intervention, one could say it's quite, let's call it a sizable effect. Effects are, however, heterogeneous. As you can imagine, there were some households who could reduce their consumption by 5–6%. These were mainly the high consumption households, which makes sense. They have just more leverage, so they can save more, while the efficient households, they probably just have very little to go to become more efficient. Now, a second example, also from the energy sector, framing. This is also a theory by Daniel Kahneman, matters. So how information is presented, even though if it's equivalent, should lead to the same decisions by individuals. And Kahneman in his first experiment showed that this is not the case. It depends how you frame this information. I think if there would be someone from marketing here, he or she would probably agree. Framing on the individual level is considered a cognitive bias because it influences how individuals perceive information and make decisions based on the way it's presented rather than solely on the content of the information itself. How can we use that again? So this behavioral economics, or the things I do, is really about, okay, so now we know that this is a facet of human behavior. Is there some leverage point on the policy side or on the intervention side with respect to framing? So there are tons of psychological experiments on it that even though the information is equivalent, we make different decisions on it. Now here's another experiment. So how to use it for behavior change. So there's a study by Bollinger, who is a US economist. He ran a field experiment and he designed 2 advertising campaigns. He wanted to motivate households to install solar panels. They designed 2 framing or 2 messaging campaigns. One was about what they refer, okay, let's basically motivate the homo economicus in these households. You can save a lot of money by installing solar on your household. And the other one, no, let's get the pro-social message out, like a little bit that people care about what the community does or what everyone does. And the other campaign focused on our communities doing something together to have more clean energy. Campaigns were launched in 30 municipalities. They were split equally into some got the pro-social campaign and some got the self-interest campaign. And the outcome, which I tried to measure on the community level or village level, was how many residential solar rooftops were installed. Now here you can see the two advertising campaigns. They are very, very similar. On the left-hand side, you see take control of high energy costs and save thousands through this unique solar opportunity. So clearly trying to make sure that homo economicus is motivated, cost-benefit analysis, you save a lot of money, etc. While the advertising campaign on the right-hand side was our town is coming together as a community to offer solar energy to residents at discounted pricing. Community selected, etc., etc. So it's this, okay, we come together, we do this together in the energy transition, etc. So they're hardly, so you can hardly distinguish them, right? Now what happened? I think the results are pretty clear. So what you see here on the horizontal line is time, while on the vertical line you see installations on the residential level. And the 3 colors, the blue color is the control group. So basically there was no advertising campaign. A couple of villages, there were no leaflets. The red line is the pro-social campaign and the self-interest is the green campaign, while the gray bar is the intervention period. So the campaign was like active for 5 weeks. Everything before 0. On the horizontal line is installations before any advertising campaign. The gray bar, advertising campaign, and what happened after. Well, 2, 3 observations. Before 0, those 3 lines are more or less the same. So we see homeowners are equally motivated to install solar panels. During the campaign time, we have a big spike on the self-interest villages, so the green line, meaning, well, this was pretty successful, right? It's like 3 times as big as the control group. And even though we see a spike in the pro-social, so we also see that this advertising campaign helped, but it's probably just half of the effect size. And then we can see what happens afterwards. Installations drop, but the green line consistently stays above all the other villages, I think, for up to 2 years. So that's pretty long. And the later also speaks that basically once many people installed, other people also installed, etc. And you've seen this was a very light touch intervention, so to say. Just use some different words and you have like effect sizes which are 2 times or 3 times as high as in all other communities. Now, out of this, I've shown you 2 experiments in the last 10 to 15 years, one could say, after having our classic policy theory, prices, regulations, standards, etc., we have developed somehow, or the field has developed like a new policy theory, and which tries to push people what the developer like Taylor and Sunstein, who also obtained the Nobel Prize for those ideas, would call help make better decisions at the individual level, like help make decisions that you get pension insurance, help make decisions that you go to the doctor, help you make decisions to install a solar panel or to buy an electric car, etc. And it's based on exactly the point that people do not always make fully rational or optimal decisions, especially if decisions are complex. And the type of interventions I've shown you can also be summarized in the form of behavioral nudges or behavioral interventions, a word you probably have come across, or you might have seen one of the books. There are now a couple editions of Richard Thaler's and Kay Sunstein book on nudging on it, and it explains you a little bit the concept of choice architecture, which refers to how the decision context is basically structured. And we know that this is going to influence your decision making. This could be the order in which choices are shown, defaults, the type of information. I've shown a couple of examples of that, or providing feedback, etc., are going to basically push you into a desired direction of the policymaker. So the policymaker either wants to reach a societal goal, like making more sustainable decisions, or also like wants to increase individual welfare, like making healthy decisions, getting an insurance, saving for pension, etc. Also these are decisions the policymaker would be interested. Here you can also see a couple of books. It's also sometimes referred as behavioral public policy. So basically, if we know about behavior, what does this mean for policy? So it is the use, I've shown you 2 examples of behavioral insights to design effective and as much as legitimate public policy. You see here a couple of articles in The Economist, as much as in the Financial Times on it. And it needs to be said, so this is not a niche idea anymore, I believe. It has become a little bit mainstream, but this is a new policy tool. You can look up the European Commission. It has an own behavioral insight team. The World Bank has one, the FAO in Rome has one, the OECD in Paris has one. There's one in Vienna. Where it originated is in fact in the UK, the so-called BIT team. It's called the Behavioral Insight Team. Many years back, it was the first group of behavioral scientists which were within the UK government, trying to help the government to basically modify some of the policies or their messaging, etc., in order to push or in order to motivate more sustainable decisions, more healthy decisions, etc. Nowadays, the Behavioral Insight Team is in fact outside the UK government. It has evolved as an outside agency, but it's still consulting the government. And on the right-hand side, you see an overview of the OECD, which has tried to map this behavioral insights team within as much as outside government, trying to come up with policy interventions which work. Here are a couple of examples of the behavioral insight team. We can very much recommend their homepage and what they do. How can we increase smart thermostat effectiveness by knowing how behavior works? How can we cut single-use plastic? Reducing household power usage, boosting food waste and recycling. With those types of interventions I've just shown you. I can only invite you to look it up if you're interested. Now, the second question I would also like to answer before I come to another example is what works to achieve behavioral change. And for that, the decision maker usually has a dilemma, because every challenge or every policy problem probably has many potential good solutions, but time and funding are limited. So what to do? Well, this is then another field which is very much linked to behavioral science, is evidence-based policy and decision making. So what is this? So evidence-based policy is the idea that political decisions or policies should be based on objective evidence or justified by it. So we should only implement the policy if we know that it works, or if we know that it changes behavior, and we should have good evidence for it. So where does this evidence-based policy hypo decision making come from? Well, it comes from another group of economists, 3 development economists, in fact, among them Esther Duflo, who won the Nobel Prize for exactly their work, for bringing evidence-based policy making to development economics, so to making development policy more effective. So she has pioneered, or they have pioneered, the field of using experimental trials, so randomized control trials, into development economics. Basically, they were also the first one taking RCTs, experiments from the medical field to the social sciences. That happened like 20 years ago, so to say, because before the social sciences were not experimental. Social sciences are usually quite data driven, but we usually use secondary data. We definitely were not an experimental field, but this has changed with a couple of economists many years ago trying to bring RCTs into the social sciences. And they use it in order to design more effective effective policies, as much as interventions in development economics. So what they studied was a lot about how can we reduce poverty, how can we lift people out of poverty. Now, maybe two other prerequisites. So how can we measure whether policy or intervention really works? Well, for that, we need to answer 2 questions in the social sciences. We need to know what happened. So we need to have the outcome, such as the installations of the solar panels, after an intervention, after a measure, or after policy has been taken. But we also need to answer the second question. What would the outcome have been if there had been no intervention? So we need a comparison group. Like in a medical RCT, like you have a control group who doesn't get the med or the vaccination, and we have a treatment group who gets the vaccination. It's the same in the social sciences. So we need to answer both questions in order to have a clean test if an intervention changes behavior or affects behavior or decision making. For that, we need to apply experiments. Randomized control trials would be the gold standard. There are also online experiments, lab experiments, etc. In order to basically answer 2 questions, what experiments do, they randomize. So we randomly assign individuals or participants or households into a treatment group who receives the intervention or the campaign, and a control group who does not receive it. The difference gives us quite confidence that we can measure the causal effect of an intervention. And only in this way we can confidently say the effect comes from the intervention and not from other factors. So basically, randomization takes care of all the problems. With that method, we can learn what works. We can, at best, avoid costly programs or policies which don't work. We can improve resources, based decisions on data, coming back to evidence-based policy making and not assumptions. Well, here you see a couple of research questions too. I've shown you. So many environmental economists are nowadays using it. What impact do more moral appeal nudges have on shifting the timing of electric vehicle charging? I'll show you, do carbon footprint labels encourage behavioral change towards more climate-friendly diets? Can nudges be used to reduce the amount of food waste? Do defaults work to increase the uptake of green energy? All of those studies are based on an experimental design, which tries to make sure that we can test the causal effect of such interventions and if they effectively change behavior in the desired direction. I'll walk you through an example. So for instance, coming from energy to food, but because I personally have worked a lot on food, how can I encourage you to eat more sustainably? So I would like to move you from your carnivore diet to a more carbon-friendly diet. Well, if you ask an economist, he or she would say, well, that's pretty easy. We just make more unsustainable food more expensive. We make meat more expensive. We have a meat tax or a carbon tax, etc. We make fruits, vegetarian food cheaper through subsidies, and the job is done. So we could use meat taxes, CO2-based pricing, but we have a problem with this pricing instrument, or like with this optimal answer from an economist. It's not easy at the moment, and most of the things, carbon taxes, as much as higher meat taxes, are politically unfeasible. They're not wanted by citizens. If they're not wanted by citizens, they're usually not wanted by politicians either. So it's pretty difficult. All right, so let's come back to our other demand-side interventions, and we have a couple of them. Here's an overview of my co-author, Paul Lohmann. He looks into demand-side intervention for sustainable food systems, a meta-analysis of food policy interventions, targeting more carbon-friendly food consumption as much as waste behaviors. He looks into how can we use social norms, reordering, visual cues. He basically looks into the toolbox of behavioral public policy. What do we know about behavior, and how, besides prices, can we still motivate this behavior? I show you a very concrete example, and this is a study with Paul, because we look at carbon footprint labels. So we ask the questions, do carbon footprint labels promote more what we refer to as climatarian diets? A climatarian diet is a diet which is basically based on a lower carbon footprint. And we run an experiment for that. Okay, what was our motivation? Well, our motivation was, well, this study was run a couple of years ago, but I think it's still timely. There's a growing awareness about the climatic impact of food. We know that roughly 1/3 of our total emissions come out of the food sector, from the production as much as from the consumption. So if we would like to tackle it, if we would like to tackle carbon emissions, the food sector has a high potential. We also know that environmental labels are used in many policy domains already. If you look at the European Union, we have, for instance, the energy efficiency label for many, many years, right? And the energy efficiency label gives you some information if you buy an energy appliance, if it's very efficient or if it's not so efficient, and how much energy you're going to use. So basically it gives you information about the environmental characteristic of a product. We thought, okay, why not use that for food or for meals in this very specific case? So we were interested in what happens if you use a carbon label. A carbon label gives you information about the carbon footprint of what you eat. So basically, if it's rather high, is it very carbon intensive? Or if the carbon footprint of what you eat is rather low, so it has very good environmental characteristics. So we designed such a label, as you can see on the left, with the help of a startup in Cambridge. And the label is a typical traffic light label. What does that mean? Most labels in the environmental domain are traffic light labels, meaning just they give you a visual cue with the color if this is good or bad. If it's like if the car if it's red, this would mean, oh, your carbon footprint is really heavy of this burger. If it's green, this would mean, oh, the carbon footprint of what you eat here is rather low. So it gives you a very quick decision heuristic to infer the environmental characteristic of what you eat. And you can see on the right also the implementation. So we implemented that, I'll come to that in a second, in cafeterias in Cambridge, where we basically labeled everything people could order there. So we conducted a field study on RCT, and our aim was to figure this out, because carbon labels are highly discussed now, also for food. There's still no European directive for it, that they are mandatory, but the European Commission is thinking about making them mandatory. But so far, all type of food labels or carbon labels you see also in the supermarket, they're all voluntary labels. They are usually designed by marketing managers of the respective companies, but they have no legal foundation that they have to be there. So our aim is, well, if we would implement such a carbon label directive, would it even influence consumer? Would it influence the demand? Would it change their decisions? So we designed an experiment, and we wanted to answer the two questions. What happens if there is the intervention. So we selected 5 cafeterias where we basically rolled out a carbon footprint label scheme, where all meals in these cafeterias were labeled either having a high carbon footprint or low carbon footprint, but consumers could infer the environmental characteristic of all meals. And we can also answer the second question, what is the outcome if we don't do that? So we had so-called control cafeterias, like 2 of them, where we did not implement such a carbon footprint label scheme. We collected data over 2 university terms, Michaelmas and Land term, and we had a baseline period where we did not have any labeling scheme, then implemented the scheme in our treatment cafeterias, and over the university term, we observed roughly 80,000 food choices, because students eat there for dinner as much as for lunch. And we have pretty great data because we know, so we have this control as much as treatment setup, but we can also track individuals at the individual level because people pay with their university card. So we can also see what happens not only between control and treatment, but also what happens at the individual level. Now here you can see our super highly representative setting of high elite students, but I can promise you they are also humans. They're hungry and they usually eat quite normally in our setting. And on the right-hand side, you can also see the very representative Mensas we are working. You see here King's College, which in fact is a quite beautiful dining hall. But again, I'll make some claims later how with respect to the external validity of our results. But what do we find? So we have 3 outcome variables because we can differentiate our data in what happens to the demand for vegetarian and vegan food, because we just make a binary indicator. We have more detailed data because for every meal which is purchased, which is in our sales data, we know the carbon footprint. So we can make another binary variable saying, oh, someone bought a high carbon meal or a low carbon meal. And we have even more granular data because we know the CO2 equivalent per meal purchased. So we can also measure our treatment effect on the carbon footprint per meal sold. And I mean, the outcomes are very clear. We find modest results, but they're highly statistically significant of carbon footprint labels on food choices. More precisely, we reduced the demand roughly by 1.82 percentage points. We increased the demand by roughly 2 percentage points of vegetarian and vegan food. We decreased the demand of high carbon purchases, burgers or meat heavy dishes, by roughly 3 percentage points. And on the meal level, as we can measure how much CO2 we reduce per purchase, we see roughly 5% reduction of the carbon footprint of an average meal purchased. Well, what does this tell you? First, it tells you, okay, carbon footprint labels have an impact, but it also tells you it's not huge, right? I mean, we're talking here about 2, 3, 4 percentage points. And coming back to the external validity of our results, like what we have here is like the best case, because we implement the carbon labeling scheme on a highly educated sample. So people who probably have already some green preferences to act on, right, or are already environmental conscious, okay, they read the label and then they act on it. And even under this best case scenario, we only have like 2-3% of demand changes. Which also tells you if we would go with the same thing to a more representative sample, effect sizes are probably 0. So that's what you can get. So next time when you hear that someone or politicians want to implement a carbon label scheme, you can say that's a great idea, but it will hardly change demand. And under more representative samples, like for instance, if we do it in this Mensa here, we will probably get even lower effect sizes or no effect size. So then you would probably ask, okay, why implement it then, right? I mean, there are 2 things we cannot measure here. What we measure is the effect on the demand, not great. What we don't measure is the long-term effect, because we do believe that labels have an information signal. So basically, consumers learn over time that what they could eat, etc. Our interventions is very short-lived. It's just 2 university terms, but more information, we also know this from economics, is usually better for consumers, but we cannot measure this effect. And then there's a third effect we cannot measure at all, but that's the effect labels will have the biggest effect. It's on the supplier side. For instance, when we talk, or when our partner who did the calculation of the carbon footprint for all meals. Then it's a carbon labeling company. Then I work with a lot of caterers. And when they talk to the suppliers says, well, look, I have 100 dishes in my catering service. Please label me all of those products. And all products which are red, I don't want to have in my assortment next year. So there will be, carbon labels will have a big impact on the supplier side, basically what the supplier decides you to offer. So carbon labels are, so to say, not useless, quite the opposite, because I think they will have a big effect on the supplier, but what this tells you, they will hardly affect the consumer. To summarize that, this is not the only study which tells you that demand effects are limited. So limited effects, therefore I believe nudges or behavioral interventions or the type of interventions I've shown you should be used as an additional tool. So they're not useless, they can lead to changes in decision making, but limited demand changes 2 to 5%. And the recommendation would be, okay, see it as an additional policy box where what you can make use of, but never trust on it like alone. And you can see also here a couple of studies which tells us that there has been a bit of a hype that we can now solely rely on these nudges or behavioral interventions to basically make us greener or more healthier. And this is clearly not the case. There's no evidence for that. Now coming to one of my so okay, I've shown you how difficult demand-side interventions, and here also a couple of critiques on this. You see here, lifestyle changes aren't enough to save the planet. Taking power as individuals, by individuals, climate action can't save us. To save the planet, we need systematic change. Individual choices matter, but who cares, right? Michael Mann, a famous climate scientist at Penn, says we need systematic change that will reduce everyone's carbon footprint, whether or not they care or whether or not they read the label, right? So how do we get there? So what is needed, or what would I recommend for more fundamental systematic change? Well, let's imagine there's a lot of awareness of personal consumption. Everyone wants to live green. Most energy comes from renewable resources. All buildings have zero energy, perfectly renovated, heat pumps, etc. Cities have public transport instead of roads. They have district heating. Industrial processes will get more efficient, less plastic, less meat, all cars electric. Sounds great, no? But so how do we get there? What will make this possible? Behavior change. Basically that we wake up all tomorrow and say, well, great, let's just live sustainably, like voluntariness, more information, more labels, our moral duties. We think we should do that. Nudges, education, things I've shown you in this presentation. Or do we need better technologies? Could we just say, oh, well, let's just invent better technologies and we will fix it? Innovation, is this going to fix it? Well, yes and no, it's going to need that. But most likely, it will also need carbon pricing. And I will try to tell you why. So carbon pricing comes in two forms. It can come in the form of the carbon tax, or it can also come in the form of emission trading. Sometimes we also use both instruments. For instance, in the European Union, we see an emission trading scheme where the big companies take part, and individual countries also, like Austria, recently introduced also a carbon tax, which makes energy, which has a lot of carbon, more expensive. And the good thing of a carbon tax is that what we forget, what I've just shown you, the label influences the consumer, maybe a bit the supplier in the food sector. But a carbon tax will have economy-wide effects. It will affect decision of all consumers in all domains, all producers in all domains, all investors in all domains, all innovators, etc. So it has a very systematic effect on everyone, because everything we do needs some type of energy. If we heat, if we drive, the same for companies, the same for consumers. And that's a very systematic effect many people sometimes overlook. And with the help of that, we're probably able to scale up emission reductions across industries and economies from small scale to large scale. I'll show you a couple of, so how is the status at the moment? Where do we see carbon pricing? So what you can see here is a world map. The different colors shows you different implementations of carbon pricing. Carbon pricing can come in the form of a tax or an a market like the European emission trading scheme, for instance. We also know, if we count all these economies you see colored here, who have one of the two or both schemes implemented, if we count everything together, we know that trading schemes, markets, as much as CO2 taxes cover roughly at the moment 20% of all global carbon emissions. That's not so much. So as an economist, we would say, well, it's still very little. We would, in fact, would like to cover more of all carbon emissions. But at the moment, it's like roughly 20%. How high are the prices we see? So what you see here is on the horizontal line, the different countries, which has one of the carbon pricing schemes. And on the vertical axis, we see the price for 1 ton of carbon. You can see that most countries, probably 3/4, the prices are below $50. So 1 ton of carbon costs $50. While we only have a couple of countries which are above 50, and then we only have 2 or 3 countries which has carbon prices above $100. And the gray bar you see would be the recommendation at the moment where carbon prices should be in order that they bite, right? If we implement the carbon price with 10 or 20, they will hardly change consumer and producer decisions. So you need a price which is high enough in order to bite. And we see this in very few economies at the moment. So this tells us not only we have few countries who use this instrument, but it also tells us the countries which use it, unfortunately, have set very low tax rates at the moment. Last example, why are carbon taxes great? So here you see Sweden. Well, Sweden is a great country, right? It has IKEA, ABBA, the royal family, Björn Borg, for those who play tennis. But Sweden has also one more thing most people don't know about. Since 15 or 20 years, it has a carbon tax. It was one of the first countries in Europe to implement it. And it did another smart thing. It implemented a very high carbon tax. It's still the highest carbon tax we see. So it's roughly at the moment $130 per ton of carbon, which means energy which has a lot of carbon really gets expensive in Sweden. What's the good thing of that? Well, the last 30 years, Sweden reduced their carbon emissions by 30%. Wow, that's pretty substantial. I mean, I've shown you most graphs. So most countries have not achieved such a reduction. In fact, many countries still are increasing their emissions. How was this possible? Well, it was possible, first of all, they implemented a carbon tax, and a substantial one. They also accompanied it with other tax changes. They abolished wealth and inheritance taxes, they adjusted property taxes, and they put a lot of that money also in environmental initiatives. So it was a tax reform, so to say. It's the most significant tax we see worldwide. Nordhaus and Stern are two economists who in fact recommend levels even below that. What Sweden has, we see the European Union trading scheme currently has a price of 90, so it's getting better. And here the recommendations, Austria has a very, just to put the numbers in perspective, Austria currently has a tax of around 30, and it's meant to increase only up to 50. That's just a third of the tax in Sweden, etc. Well, why is it so difficult? So first, why we have so few countries who have a tax, and second, if there's a tax, why are those taxes so low and not follow the recommendations of rather more significant or high taxes? Well, there are many reasons for it. There's a lot of lobbying going on. There are behavioral reasons. There's always a discussion, should we use emission trading or should we go for tax? Should we combine it? Not so easy to solve. There's also socioeconomic concerns, economic concerns. Industries always say, well, if we have a carbon tax, that will hurt us, competition concerns, etc. There's also fairness concerns. What happens with low-income households on a high carbon tax? Political feasibility. People hate taxes usually, and if citizens hate taxes, politicians don't like them, and so they are not implemented. And what we should see, coming back to the point that climate change is a global problem, we in fact would need like a global carbon tax, and that's super difficult. Mainly because tax systems are basically governed by national sovereignty. Not even the EU has supranational taxes. And think about it at the global level, it's really, really difficult. So this is another thing which hampers the implementations of those taxes. Now let me get to my final slides. So what should we do now? So just to exemplify the difference, what would happen if we implement the carbon price, and what would happen if we would go for what I've shown you, a carbon footprint label. So what cuts more carbon, pricing versus nudging? So I now assume a pretty high carbon price. I was a bit bold to say, let's go for 200. What would that lead to? Well, this would lead to the increased prices of high emission foods, mainly meat, because it has a lot of methane, as much as the transport of it, which goes increase, which would then again increase the price of meat, or not only meat, high emission foods, while labels would basically make carbon footprint visible at the point of purchase, and we would hope that consumers read it and take this environmental characteristic into account. The price would reduce demand, and it would reduce so substantially. I mean, these are rough estimates, but for the food sector, it would mean it would probably reduce high demand for beef, dairy, shift to plant-based by roughly 50%. If at the individual level, this would mean you would reduce your carbon footprint by roughly 1.4 ton per person per year. While if I use a carbon footprint, in the best case, I get a demand reduction of 2%, which would reduce carbon emissions at the individual level by 0.05 tons. And the main difference is a carbon price would not only affect your decisions for food, but would also affect all your other decisions for transport, for heating, for housing, etc. While nudging or a label would basically stick with the demand effect on your food choices. There are obviously other characteristics besides effectiveness. We would consider implementation costs, political acceptability as much as equity. And here the instruments are also very different. Implementation is obviously not so easy with a tax, would be easier with an information instrument. Political acceptability is unfortunately super low for taxation, particularly also like think about meat taxes. While for information, people say, well, yeah, just implement it, give us more information. And there would be some equity concerns we also would have to deal with if we would go for a carbon tax. So my message would be that CO2 pricing will deliver bigger cuts, and it will do so faster. So if you think about the transition, and if you think about that we would like to be net zero by 2040, 2050, right? That's the goals which the European Union sets, and that counts for Austria as much as at the national level. That's only 15 years from now, right? What carbon pricing would do is it would be way faster. So we basically think about if we implement carbon pricing, we will reach the transition with the Ferrari. If we go with information and nudging, we'll probably get there, but it's probably more the Fiat Panda we are on the way. And ideally, we will combine both. So to summarize my presentation, what I wanted to show you is that motivation for climate action or behavior is multifaceted. I do believe that behavioral interventions are effective or can be effective, depending on the circumstances, to encourage smaller behavioral shifts, but they might likely not be sufficient on their own to drive large-scale systematic change. I also believe, and I hope this was clear, that I think evidence-based studies, also in the social science, using RCT's experimental work are essential because we don't have the time to implement things which don't work, to identify the most effective interventions and ensure that policies and strategies are grounded in proven behavioral science, so how people make decisions and data. I still think that CO2 pricing is a key instrument for a fast transition and for bigger cuts in carbon emissions, but cannot work in isolation. And at best, I do think behavioral public policy should complement price instruments in order to achieve climate goals such as net zero transition in the next 15 to 20 years. And I think with that, I close my presentation.
So thank you, Elisabeth. Thank you for bringing up the topic. It's very interesting to see how complex sustainability is and how many factors actually have an impact on the decision we take at a global level. So I would like to know if there are any questions from the audience or from the people that are attending the seminar remotely. I mean, if you have a question from remote, please just write them in the chat and I will read it loud for you. Yeah.
So it works. So thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting for me. The question, actually, it's more like a curiosity that I have. So you were talking about this behavioral nudges and CO2 pricing. So I'm interested to know how this would impact, or is there a study that would explore how this would impact on different economic classes? People, if you're talking about the society, how it's going to impact the people belonging to different classes of economy?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, particularly with pricing, we are also usually concerned about, let's say, low-income households because we know that they spend more money on energy, so be it electricity bill, driving, transport, etc., of their total income. So carbon pricing will hit them harder. That's not great, but there are two things to consider. The first thing is to consider, for instance, when we discuss carbon pricing, always say, yeah, but we need to take care of fairness, social justice, etc. That's true, but you always should judge an instrument by its main objective. Carbon pricing is an environmental policy instrument, so it has one objective: it wants to reduce carbon emissions. Good. It's like you should not think about carbon pricing that it's going to solve inequality. It's unfortunately a huge other problem. We need to solve with another instrument. And carbon taxes can be designed in order to ease out inequalities they would create. And they should be designed, and most of them are designed. There are redistribution mechanisms to help low-income households, which would be hit harder by such an instrument. But I think it should not necessarily be used as an argument against it, because, yeah, you should judge an instrument by its purpose. And usually one instrument can only have one purpose. And carbon pricing should reduce carbon emissions, while inequality, you need to deal with other things. So yeah, there are studies out there that this is an issue, so to say, because of the fact that low-income households spend more money of their entire income for energy-intensive goods, but can be solved or can be at least designed with auxiliary instruments around them. With respect to the information instrument, I mean, we also, like, not in this study, but in other studies we did with more representative samples in the UK, we don't see a difference between socioeconomic characteristics and how people react to this information. So there are no heterogeneous effects with respect to like income or gender or something like that. So it seems we shouldn't be so concerned about that. Like, you could be concerned about the question, who is more gullible, right? Who can be more convinced by nudges? Is it like the poor or the low-income households? And at least in the food sector, with our information intervention, we don't see that.
Yeah, because I was just wondering, as a normal person, like, for example, there is already this economic inequality. And if you're thinking about carbon pricing, it would be more, I feel like it's going to be, this economic gap is going to increase, and it's going to become much wider when you compare to, because people who are already in the rich class, they can pay, but still they can use more. I mean, they have money, so they can afford it. But if you look at the lower income people, they don't have the money, so it eventually affects them.
No, exactly, and so we know that. And for instance, as an example, the carbon tax in Austria tries to account for that. There is a redistribution mechanism, so you pay the tax. Energy is now more expensive. Your electricity bill is higher, like slightly higher. The tax is very low. The fuel has become more expensive as well in Austria, and that hits those low-income households harder. But they have implemented. It's called climate bonus, which only goes to low-income households in order to ease out that they're hit harder by the instrument. Yeah. But there is clearly an inequality issue, but the environmental policy instrument is unfortunately not going to solve inequality, which is a huge issue. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so there's a question from Guilherme. He's saying, I understand that individual behavior matters for sustainability, but data shows individual cause only 20-30% of emissions, while corporations are behind about 70%. Doesn't this put an unfair burden on people? Do you also look at how industry can change its behavior? Otherwise, isn't there a risk of greenwashing, shifting focus away from the real drivers of pollution? Carbon taxes again just shifts the burden to individuals.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I haven't talked much about the corporations today, but it's correct. They are responsible for a very big share. And I think there has been the more recent debate focuses on a lot of that. Again, an example of two policy instruments which are currently used for industry or companies. So the European Union basically says, well, just write a sustainability report, like the CSRD directive. All those companies now need to report how many emissions they have. It's a bit like labeling. Yeah, they will change their behavior. Now they have to report their emissions, etc. This will reduce the emissions of those industries. But again, if there would be carbon pricing, and if this carbon pricing would be essential, then these companies would have to pay so much more for their production, etc., etc. So they would basically invest in more energy efficient technologies. They would try to substitute their products from plastic to something more sustainable if there would be higher carbon pricing, because carbon pricing will affect consumers, but it will affect producers as hard. And at the moment, yeah, the European Union goes with an information instrument or transparency instruments, which will change the behavior of some actors, but again, very slow and with a more modest shift.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Any other? Yeah.
Thank you, Elisabeth. Extremely interesting presentation. Actually, it makes us think a lot of things. One thing that I wonder about is that how do you calculate the carbon output of a product? How can you put a label and on what is based? Because I was thinking that, for example, let's say that sugar has a very low carbon footprint. Okay, I don't know what I'm thinking. Okay, but then we know that drinking sodas with a lot of sugar would affect terribly your health. It goes to obesity, it goes to cancer and everything. And this would cause a lot of emissions because of the health system. But this cannot be calculated in the carbon footprint. So it's so complicated that it's difficult. And sometimes it might be also, I mean, what you're proposing here is meat versus vegetables, that we know that for health is better than vegetables better. But I think if you take each product individually, not always what is has a low carbon footprint would be good for health. So this is also very controversial, no? So it's also, this is what I would like to understand. How do you calculate this carbon footprint of its product?
Two things. So you're correctly right about the health impact. I mean, I was focusing very much on more sustainable decisions. But if you look at, for instance, the Lancet Commission basically would recommend a planetary healthy diet. So a diet should not only be sustainable, but at the same time healthy. So this would be dietary guidelines we should go for. I mean, what we see in this study, we also have other studies where we now check, okay, do customers in our experiments not only make more sustainable decisions, but also more healthy. And on average, that's true. A more sustainable diet is usually also more healthy. So we see in other studies that people not only reduce their carbon footprint, with, for instance, a label intervention, but they also increase the Nutri-score. So we use other indicators for the food. So on average, that's true, but it might not be at the individual level. How this is calculated, more generally speaking, so carbon footprint with respect to food is done with life cycle analysis. So we do this with a startup in Cambridge who does it for us. I'm not a life cycle analyst. I mean, life cycle analysis has its limitation because at some point you have to stop calculating. Like you have to close the system. There are standardized methodologies for that, but clearly what you described, those type of emissions later are not calculated for. There are already problems earlier because you probably already have to have to close the system. Where does the sugar come from? Are you going down the very much of supply chain? Yeah, so I mean, it's when you see a footprint estimate, it's a rough estimate. It's never the true value because you have to make a lot of subjective decisions where you stop calculating in the system, right? So you have to draw borders, which makes it subjective. But more generally, I think the positive message is that on average, a more sustainable diet is probably also a more healthier one is true, which is a good. So these two goals, policy goals, are more or less aligned on average. Might not true all products, but on average, it's true. That's a very good point.
Thank you. There's another question from the audience here.
Hello, thank you. I had one question which was related to what Anjana asked already about the climate bonus or Klimageld. Are there studies that it is working and that it is indeed like that these poor families or consumers, poorer consumers don't suffer from this or and suffer much less from this than higher ones? And another question I have, I know that so the IIT publishes a report about their energy consumption and carbon footprint. And from this, I was shocked when I saw the numbers because if I calculate it on a per person level, it would be something like 6 or more than 6 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions per person per year, which is more than half of the average, which is because it's like 11 tons or something for a European citizen. What can you suggest here to also to reduce this amount or give me hope that this is, and also maybe is it normal that it's such a huge impact? Thank you.
Maybe later on the carbon footprint. Yeah. Sorry. So very good point. I mean, there's one thing I was not talking about. So first of all, the numbers you say are pretty correct. Like in Europe, we see that individuals have a carbon footprint somewhere between 8 and 12 tons, probably. But we should also be realistic. I've shown you policy instruments where we can reduce this carbon footprint, but we will never reduce it to zero, right? Because we will always use energy to some extent, which might not be totally clean. And we should also be aware of the limitations of the carbon footprint concept, so to say. I think another concept which I'm a big fan of is not the carbon footprint, but the it's called what you can do with your hands. So basically, people can choose, okay, I'm going to shift a little bit my diet and I reduce from 7 to 6 tons. But you won't, like living in Europe, you won't get much lower than that. But you can do many other things. For instance, you can decide to take up a career in the green industry. Like I work as an environmental economist since 15, 20 years, and that was probably way more impactful than reducing my footprint or flying one flight less. So you can take up a job in this, you can educate people, you can become a teacher, you can, and things like this. So I think there are many other leverage points we have, which are probably more impactful than reducing from 6 to 5 tons. So yes, I think at the individual level, we have some leverage, but there's also a limit to that, how much we can reduce it. I think we should be aware of that there are other leverage points. We can vote for green parties. So there are other more systematic leverage points we have, which I didn't get into today too much. And could you repeat the first question?
About the climate bonus.
Yeah, I don't recall one exact result, but so for instance, because I've looked a little bit at the documents of Austria recently, it has not been systematically evaluated, but yeah, it's very clear what we know is that low-income households now spend more money on this tax, which is not good. But they also, through the redistribution mechanism, through this bonus, they're basically lifted out of this, but there are no long-term studies. But I think it has definitely alleviated that more inequality will occur. Let's say inequality has stayed the same with the redistribution mechanism, which is not great, but we need to tackle inequality, lower high income households with way other systematic changes than the carbon tax.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning, and thanks for your very interesting presentation. I totally agree with you that your conclusion that let's say climate action needs a mix of actions. During your presentation, I considered several, let's say, potential other things to think about, like the role of education. So to start from the current and let's say especially the future consumers, the role of information. Sustainability before the COVID crisis was the must. Then the war in between Russia and Ukraine, then the war in Gaza, and then the COVID crisis, and so on. So the things, let's say, that are putting sustainability and climate action, let's say, after. And the same also to save the production of iron, steel, and very important sectors in Europe. It's also a must because it means to save jobs. I was wondering to know if in your research you highlight some action that can also convince developing countries or BRICS to be involved, and what are the differences according to you that this lesson and your presentation, that is again very interesting, but I guess more dedicated to our Europe, our developed context, and what and how we can involve the developing countries on this same action. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So I haven't worked much in developing countries. Well, I've worked on deforestation, so I've worked on other problems there, but not so much with respect to climate action. But the discussion is a little bit how we, or be it Europe or developed countries, can help them in this transition, because we have all the economic means for this transition. That's very clear. Europe can be carbon neutral in 15 years if it wants to be carbon neutral, because we have the means to do it. While the countries you are mentioning, they probably want it, but they don't have the means to do it. So I mean, what happens a lot also in the yearly climate negotiations is talking about how to finance the transition. How to finance the transition for these countries, because we have the means to do it. So Europe shouldn't be worried. I know we can do it, and we have the economic means. So what it needs is a lot of what sometimes you might have heard, that climate finance. And when we talk about climate finance, we talk about how can we help these countries to finance this, because yeah, it's costly to change technologies, and carbon pricing is costly. If fuel gets more expensive, there are even more poor people there, etc. And there needs to be more action, clearly. On this, because yeah, so far all the talks always end that the developing countries are, yeah, guys, you tell us we should reduce our carbon, but we first need to grow our economies, and you don't help us with it, then it will be difficult. So yeah, besides that, we need to focus on some policies, interventions here to, I think, speed up, let's call it, transition. We clearly, Europe, for instance, has a role in lifting other countries to be able to have this transition, because at the moment many of those don't have the means to do it, and the climate finance issue is a big bottleneck. I don't know how to solve it, but that's a bit the point I would answer. Thanks.
You hear me? Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thank you for the nice talk. I do agree that it's important for us to know that consumers can have a lot of power in decreasing the CO2 emissions. But I have a question regarding the role of industry. And so I totally agree that increasing carbon prices will force them to decrease their CO2 emissions. But how do you go about when industries have so much power in policymaking and they have so much influence in governments, right? And they can just influence this policy to their benefit so they can keep increasing their CO2 emissions or just increasing their production, right? So how do we go about that? And do you think consumers also have a role in helping this or going against fighting this influence that industry has in this?
Yeah, excellent question. So first of all, yes, we know they have a lot of power, and we know they already lobby all those things we see. So one reason why we don't see more stringent regulation at the European level, and we only see it's now for companies, the sustainability reporting directives. So companies have to report what they do, which is a very soft touch instrument, is because companies told the Commission, we don't like that. We don't want to have higher prices. This will hurt our competition, and so on and so on. And the reason why we see that probably the directive on electric cars will be delayed after 2035 is not that because consumers said that, is because Volkswagen went to the European Commission and said, oh, that goes so quick, we need to do this later, right? So you're perfectly right. That's a huge problem. I mean, there are a couple of leverage points. First of all, consumers have leverage points, be it consumer boycotts. I mean, you can vote, like we do vote for parties, but you can also vote for products you buy to some extent. I think if Volkswagen and the traditional companies continue like that, they're voted out by the Chinese companies anyway, because they're not innovating at the moment. It will hurt them that they're not going to better and greener technologies. I think they will soon realize this. And maybe they're off the market anyway in 10 years. So consumers have a vote, so to say, on the consumer side. And there's a second point I did not mention much, because I'm not fully an expert, but there is also the legal perspective. So we have seen now a lot of climate litigation cases where, be it NGOs, individual consumers, go against companies, against Shell, against the big oil companies, and take them in front of the court and tell them, guys, you signed, or countries, you signed the Kyoto Treaty, but you're not obliging to it. And there are cases where these NGOs and these people win. And companies are very afraid of that. And we will see more of these climate litigation cases. This is an evolving field, basically, only exists since 10 years, where the rule of law is used to bring these companies in front of the court. And so they have to kind of say why they did not reduce emissions, why they signed the Kyoto Treaty, why they're like, for instance, human rights courts. There's one case where an NGO went in front of the human rights courts and say, well, this company, oil, is basically, due to these emissions and due to the climate disasters, basically affecting human lives. And they're right. So now, and that will become a bigger problem for companies, and we will probably force them also in the transition. So there are a couple of leverage points on the consumer side. You can vote with what you buy, as much as I think the rule of law and these climate litigation cases will become more frequent and will push companies more into transition. At least that's what's currently happening on a slow pace, but that's what I see. These are two things which would speak in favor that industry is moving faster.
Okay, there's more a comment than a question from Julia. She's saying, I think this is arguable that doing this or that job, less or more green, can be considered as alternative to personal footprint. The amount of available green jobs is limited by political and economical reason. Reducing in this way your personal footprint does not eventually change the impact overall on the level of, let's say, a country or globally. To the contrary, change of consumption is a direct effect. If you are eating less meat, it's a direct impact that no one can do instead of you. Another thing is, of course, doing some volunteering promotion in green field. This can be considered as an impact.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think I should hire this person for my last slide. So, no, I said, yeah, there are two things. It's a carbon footprint, but there's a lot what you can do. Yeah, you can take up green jobs. You can educate other people. You can vote for green parties. You can join NGOs. You can bring industry in front of court. So you can use a lot of your energy you have individually on many leverage points. And I think as a whole, that can work out.
Thank you. If there are no more questions, yeah, the last one.
Just a comment on that I was thinking also with the questions that the guys made, is that in the end, maybe labeling the products, not only food products in general, would help a lot, because maybe now we are not ready. But if we educate the new generations and they have the tool to see label the products about the carbon footprint, then maybe the consumers can make the difference. And I think the industry should be more afraid of this than the taxes. So we have to give time also to the people to get used to this, but we have to get the tool. So I think the labels is a very, very good tool for the customer to slowly understand what they are buying and what they are consuming and what difference they can make for the environment.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, probably to round it up, think about CO2 pricing as top-down instrument, but we're not going to solve it only with top-down. We need a bottom-up, because revolution or whatsoever, and labeling will be part of it because it's an information instrument and it will educate people, households, individuals, consumers. It will tell them what is environmental friendly. It will influence our values, probably, etc. And it will need both to be successful. So yeah, I think I totally agree with your point.
Just a comment, linking to Nasia's speech. I was wondering when you showed the slide with the label, how can a product weight 100 grams and produce 142 grams of carbon?
We standardized.
So it was thrilled about that.
The carbon footprint, which was shown on our label, was standardized on a 100-gram portion of it, because different meals have different weights. So automatically we would have a lot of disparity just because there's more food on the plate to the carbon footprint. In order to, so that's a long discussion how to display that. In order that we standardize the portion size, so to say, to have a bit of more standardization. That's why that was probably confusing, but very good question. Happy you noticed.
Thank you very much for the interesting conversation. So I was thinking, by listening to the conversation, the comments, the presentation, we say the people, we say the companies, but we are the people, and we are also the companies sometimes. So our choices, I think, can really change everything. For example, if we are at home and we turn on their condition, I mean, it's on our hand, literally, or in the car, or here at the workplace, if we think that maybe their conditioning is too much, maybe it's also in our hand to influence these things. So it was just a comment for everyone to think about it. Thank you again for the nice talk.
Thanks.
Yeah, I just want to add a comment. I just want to second what it has been said for the past two questions, that we have the power, like consumers have the power to change this. And I'm really less confident about international law right now doing anything. So
you should look, I'll send you some slides. I'm quite encouraged by it, but it's true, like I'm a bit discouraged because now we see a lot of cases of successful cases, NGOs, citizen groups, which basically win cases against BP, Shell, against provincial governance. Montana now has to implement harsher climate policy because some citizens suit them to say, guys, we don't do anything. But we shouldn't be, like, let's say, agnostic that companies are also going to use the law, and they have very good lawyers too. So yes, it's just one leverage point of many. So, but yeah, good point. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Okay.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. It was really, really interesting. And I just use this moment to say that IIT has created a community on Viva Engage that is called Sustainability. And so we're trying to actually act for sustainability as a company. And so if you have some ideas for improving IIT's GHG emissions or like the waste, etc., don't hesitate to join the community and to send messages. Thank you.
Okay, there's another one.
No, it's good. It's good.
Hi. I have a curiosity about the label of CO2 footprints. If it, I know it's already very difficult, I imagine, to do it,
And I was wondering if it integrates also, or it can integrate also other metrics about sustainability, like water consumption or field consumption, stuff like that.
That's a good point. I said with respect to label, it was calculated by a company, a student who is now a company, which we are very happy. And also, as aforementioned, it's always difficult what you include in the metric. You have to decide a lot of subjective decisions. First of all, to already come up with the carbon footprint calculation. But then, as you say, there are other valid points. There's the water footprint, for instance, which you could visualize as well. Then there are a lot of health metrics because, yeah, if you look at the Lancet Commission, they say it should be a planetary healthy diet. So in fact, you should also provide the information about the health indicators, Nutri-Score, nutrition, etc. And then we come also, I think that's also a weakness of labeling. We come into the problem, you buy a product and there are 10 labels. And you're like, yeah, there will be a bit of overload of information, which probably leads to the fact that people will disregard all the information, which is also not good. So this is clearly a big disadvantage that, yeah, there could be much other characteristics we could display, but we also run into this problem that then these characteristics might go in different directions, and which makes consumer decision making even more difficult, which is a weakness of that instrument, clearly, as you also now see it. Good point.